Coming up on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, we're going to answer what's more likely questions from the listeners, 2023 style. Plus, the Eagles have maybe their most mature quarterback room in a very long time. All that and more on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcoming Eagles fans to a Thursday edition of the show. I'm Louis DiBiase joining you as always. Thanks so much to the everydayers for making us your first listen Monday through Friday. It's a Thursday edition of the show. Really excited to get into not a listener mailbag, but today I actually reached out to our listeners to email or tweet us some questions regarding what's more likely for the 2023 season, because while there aren't a ton of question marks on paper about this team, you never know in the NFL how things are going to go in a season, especially, Eagles fans know this more than any team. The minute you think you know something about a Philadelphia Eagles team, you know the opposite. Even last year, for as good as we thought they could be on paper, what was my tone all the way up until week 1 against the Detroit Lions, and even after that win, because they still really did it with Jalen Hurts running the football. Obviously, he made some big plays to A.J. Brown down the field, but that was really more of a running style of game until that massive performance against the Minnesota Vikings week 2. What was I saying still? I said, as good as this football team looks on paper around the quarterback position, I'm not sure they can be a Super Bowl contender, which of course they became, because I didn't think Jalen Hurts could be who he eventually became. The 2022 Eagles, to me, were they the biggest surprise of all time? No, not at all. From a roster perspective, it doesn't surprise me of their success. But because of quarterback, they were a surprise. The 2017 Super Bowl team, they were a surprise. These teams were surprises for the better. There were a lot of surprise teams for the worse as well, i.e. the 2011 Philadelphia Eagles, the 2018 Philadelphia Eagles. You could say 2019 as well, 2015, 2020. The list really does go on and on. So I wanted to get into some questions that listeners have, or what they think that our answers are to some questions about what's more likely from this team in 2023. And some took more of a stat perspective. Some took more of a approach of player versus player, who's going to outperform who next year. So I want to get into those questions. We're going to start with offense in segment 1. And then we're also going to get into what's more likely on the Eagles' defensive side of the football in segment 2. So let's dive right into it, because there's some really interesting ones. And on offense, I think there's less question marks than defense, especially in the starting lineup. And we talked about that a few times on some shows over the last couple of weeks as we gear up for training camp for the Birds, which is starting up in less than 2 weeks. We're less than 2 weeks away. It's the 25th, which is Tuesday of not next week, but the week after. So the Eagles football is right around the corner. Let's start with offense. What's more likely? And the first question has to do with Jalen Hurts. What's more likely? Jalen Hurts throws for 4,200 passing yards plus and at least 25 passing touchdowns, or he yet again, for what? It would be the third year in a row, which nobody's done it 2 years in a row, regardless, let alone 3, where quarterbacks run for 700 plus rushing yards and 10 plus rushing touchdowns. Will Jalen Hurts throw for 4,200 yards plus and 25 plus passing touchdowns, or yet again run for 700 yards and 10 scores? I personally feel like the first option is more likely. Jalen Hurts the last 2 years and in 2020 has shown he's a top 3, if not I think Lamar Jackson, when healthy, is the best mobile quarterback in football. And then you can throw Justin Fields in there now as well, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts. That's your top tier. Jalen Hurts, from a stat perspective, has been the best mobile quarterback over the last 2 years. So I think his numbers rushing, they're not going to dramatically decrease, but I think maybe they definitely want to up the ante when it comes to passing attempts this year. Jalen Hurts is only going to get better to me as a passer at this point. Now I'm convinced the sky's the limit for this kid throwing the football. They're going to throw more. I think if they don't run him as much, or maybe not run him as much, but they pick their spots better, right? Like maybe they use him less in the red zone so you don't see those 10 plus rushing touchdowns. Maybe they expose him less over the middle to some of these hits that got him that injury against Chicago last year, where that made him miss 2 games. Maybe in that way, the rushing attempts go down a little bit. The spots are different. He stays healthier. Maybe he plays all 17 games. Again, I don't think those rushing numbers are going to dramatically decrease, but I do think you'll see the passing numbers increase. And he was close to 4,000 passing yards last year already. If he plays 2 more games, do I think he can get an extra, what he had, a little over 3,700 passing yards last year in 15 games played? And that last game, I don't even really count. They were just trying to get through. So basically, he missed 3 games of a healthy Jalen Hurts. And not to mention they were blowing teams out so much last year. I think games are going to be closer this year. They're going to have to pass more. So with all those reasons being said, I actually think it's more likely Jalen throws for 4,200 plus and 25 plus touchdowns. Passing touchdowns should increase. Rushing should go down a little bit. Last year he had 22 passing touchdowns. I think that definitely increases by at least 3. I would hope so. I want him to push for 30. I think it's more likely, he throws for that than 700 rushing yards and 10 touchdowns for 3 straight years. But that's definitely an interesting one. I think this team's going to continue, though, to be the most balanced football team on offense in the NFL. An interesting one now on the ground at running back. What's more likely? Rashad Penny lasts the entire season, which has never happened. Rashad Penny, we know the reason the Eagles barely owe him any money guaranteed this year and why they got him so cheap despite him being statistically, when he plays, the most efficient running back in football. The kid averages 6.4 plus yards per carry every single year when he's out there. I mean, he's so explosive. There's a reason the Seattle Seahawks took him in the first round a while back, but he just can't stay healthy. That's why the Eagles got him on a bargain. Is it more likely Penny lasts the entire year, or Kenneth Gainwell leads the backfield in overall touches by the end of the regular season? And this is interesting. I get both sides. I think Kenneth Gainwell, there's a scenario where he does lead the team in touches. If Rashad Penny does get hurt, there's one scenario. DeAndre Swift, is he injury prone like Penny? I don't think so, but he has been banged up multiple times throughout his career with the Detroit Lions. Not to mention the rotation they're going to use. I think Swift and Penny are definitely the focus of this backfield over Gainwell. But I think Gainwell is going to only get better this year. He's coming off an incredible playoff run. He has really good receiving ability. I think Jalen Hurts trusts him. Like, you look at the 2-minute warning, Hurts consistently would go to Kenny G the last 2 years in the 2-minute drill, passing the football. It's why Miles Sanders was always on the sidelines in those scenarios. So he's got good hands. He definitely took a step up with his vision in the playoffs. I thought he struggled a lot last year during the regular season. Maybe there's that year 3 jump coming. He knows there's a big opportunity for him this year that hasn't been there in years past because he knew Miles was the guy. I get the logic with this question. I could see Gainwell leading the backfield. I think it's not the ideal scenario, though. That means that Swift and Penny just weren't available enough. I think it's more likely, it's close. I think it's more likely that Penny lasts the entire year. Yeah, I do. I think he lasts the entire year. Why, though? I don't think suddenly his legs get healthier and suddenly he becomes less injury prone. I truly believe that the Eagles are going to try to not put him in bubble wrap, but really manage his touches week after week and make him an explosive, efficient player that they can rely on by relying a lot on DeAndre Swift as well, and Kenneth Gainwell, and Boston Scott, and throwing the football a lot, keeping Penny fresh. That's the best they can do. And because if you can have that kind of guy fresh in the playoffs, look at a similar player that they had during the Super Bowl run of 2017 with Jay Ajayi. When they managed his touches with LeGarrette Blount, with Corey Clement, and you got him all the way to the Super Bowl, even in the Super Bowl, you didn't want Jay Ajayi touching the football 15 to 20 times, and he didn't. But he, in that game against the Patriots, he had over 70 rushing yards. He was averaging, I don't even know, I don't have the stats in front of me. Did he even have 10 carries in that game? He was averaging seven yards a touch. So Rashad Penny can be that player again. If you can get that guy into January, that's really important. And I think the Eagles know that, and they want to manage his touches. I'm sure it's part of why they said, hey, let's bring in Swift. Yes, we really like Penny. Do we need Swift? Not necessarily, but it can only help us even more. So I'm actually going to go with the first choice again. I'll say Rashad Penny does last the whole year. And then one more on the offensive side of the football before we get into defense. More receptions. Speaking of DeAndre Swift, more receptions. What's more likely? DeAndre Swift has more catches this year, or Quez Watkins. DeAndre Swift, definitely, I think, the best receiving running back the Eagles have had since, I would say, 2019 Miles Sanders. But if you're going to talk about overall running back talent catching the football, I think it's Darren Sproles. They're going to throw to the running back more this year, I think, absolutely. But I think Quez Watkins is going to step up this year. I really do. I'm bullish on Quez. I know last year was really tough, but I still remember what he did in 2021. He's a hardworking kid. Nick Sirianni pointed out this spring who has looked the most improved since coming back for OTAs. He mentioned Quez by name. He's got a lot of talent. This kid is super young. I really do. In the Olamide Zaccheaus signing, I think it could push him. It could motivate him. Quez said after the Super Bowl, he's got that hanging over his head now, that drop, that he had a down year. He knows it. He's self-aware. I think the maturity's there. This isn't a Jalen Reagor situation. I believe in Quez. I'm bullish on him. I think it's going to be close between these two because they really are. They could be those, fourth and fifth targets in this passing game behind Smith, Goddard, and Brown. But I really do think that Quez is going to bounce back. Gino doesn't agree. I think a lot of Eagles fans won't agree. But I think Quez Watkins has more receptions than DeAndre Swift just by a. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by eBay Motors. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Liar to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for a draft, which I am in just a few weeks, or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So with draft prep underway for the upcoming season, let's see who Vinny has picked out for us in this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. And I'm going with the guy that I am targeting in the first round this year. And it's a guy that the Philadelphia Eagles should have drafted in 2020. And I kept telling them not to do it because I didn't think he was a speed guy. And I said, take Jalen Reagor or KJ Hamler or anybody else, Laviska Shenault, and man, was I wrong, but it's Minnesota Vikings wide receiver Justin Jefferson, who statistically has been the most productive wide receiver in the NFL since he came into the league just a few years ago. When it comes to the position that he plays, it's a different game in fantasy football now. Owners are gunning for receivers early now in drafts. Gone, I think, are the days of hoarding running backs where you take one or two in the first round and then you focus on wide receivers. Star receivers, especially somebody like Justin Jefferson, who is not only efficient and makes big plays, run after the catch, he had the play of the year for the ESPYs when it comes to the catch radius of that one-handed play against the Buffalo Bills, but also he's just a volume monster. And in a PPR league, especially when you get bonuses for certain statistics, Justin Jefferson is an absolute dream. Not to mention, Adam Thielen's gone. Yes, they did draft Jordan Addison in the first round, but you never know how rookie wide receivers do adjust. Kirk Cousins, he doesn't have Dalvin Cook in the backfield anymore. Are they going to throw the football even more this year? Justin Jefferson is the move for our eBay Motors fantasy pick of the week. Vinny Liar from Locked On Fantasy Football is going to help you win your fantasy championship, and eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. With eBay Guaranteed Fit and over 122 million parts and accessories for your vehicle right at your fingertips, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternators, shock struts, you name it, eBay Motors has it, and they'll make sure it's the right fit for your car because eBay Guaranteed Fit helps you understand exactly what parts you need for your vehicle the first time. So go forth, switch gears, crank the AC, and say goodbye to sweating if your ride needs a little fixing up. Because now you know you'll always be set up for success from the get-go with eBay Guaranteed Fit. Everything your vehicle is calling for is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check, get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome back in, Eagles fans. This Thursday edition of the podcast, we're going to continue on What's More Likely 2023 style. This time, flipping fields. We're going to go to the defensive side of the football for the Birds. Listeners writing in questions. What's more likely? Lou, answer them for you. I got you. On offense, we talked about what's more likely. Jalen Hurts throwing for 4,200 plus yards and 25 plus touchdowns, or yet again running for 700 plus rushing yards and 10 plus touchdowns. I said throwing more. What's more likely? Rashad Penny lasting the whole year, or Kenny G leading the running backs in touches? I said I think Penny actually does last the entire year. And then more receptions. DeAndre Swift this year as the fourth target. Behind the big three are Quez Watkins. I think Quez Watkins is definitely that bounce back candidate this year. So I went with my boy Quez. Am I a little biased? Yes, but I do think he's going to return to the 2021 form, and I don't think that basis is a total heart pick. I think there is a little bit of a head pick there for sure. And Swift is a running back, and he's going to be in a committee. I think even with Zacchaeus, in the fold this year more, I think, than Zach Pascal was last year. My money's still on Quez bouncing back in 2023. Let's go to defense, though. What's more likely? Our first question has to do with the Georgia Bulldogs, the first-round picks this year just a few months ago. Who has more sacks? What's more likely this year? Actually, it wasn't who has more sacks. It's what's more likely, Jalen Carter or Nolan Smith lead the Eagles' entire team in sacks. So not just, I thought it was going to be what's more likely, Jalen Carter has more sacks than Nolan Smith or vice versa, but this is actually a more true what's more likely type of question. So Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, who would have more sacks this year than Haason Reddick, than Josh Sweat, than Brandon Graham? All three guys, by the way, had 10-plus sacks last year. Then Fletcher Cox, who had not a career year last year with 7 sacks, but the highest total he's had since 2018? Yeah, not even 2019, 2018 when he had 10. I think, honestly, and both of these guys are going to be tough, right? I mean, they're going to be in rotations behind studs. I think it's more like, because Carter, or Smith, I should say, as I mentioned, 3 of those guys that had 10 sacks, they're all in front of Smith. So it's going to be tough for him, right? I mean, Haason Reddick's going to get a lot of snaps this year. So is Josh Sweat. So is Brandon Graham. Even if Graham is a reduced role, he's coming off a career year, and he's one of the heartbeats of this football team. So I actually think that it's probably going to be Jalen Carter, even though he's behind Fletcher Cox, even though he's in a rotation with Jordan Davis. They want to step up for sure, and he's going to have a much bigger role. I think the same thing with Milton Williams. I like Contavious Street a lot. I love the Moro Ajomo pick in the 7th round. I think I find a way to slip that in every single episode. Ajomo is definitely one of my guys that I'm watching at camp this year. I loved him coming out of Texas. He was a top 5 tackle prospect for me. You mentioned all that. And tackle, too, just naturally, edge rushers a lot of time have more sacks than defensive tackles. And Nolan Smith is explosive. I think he's going to be really good. I think he's going to figure out that ghost move like Josh Sweat has. Chris Long and them were talking about it on the podcast. I think he's the perfect kind of player, is that speed rusher. Is he going to be Von Miller, Haason Reddick? Not sure, but the potential is definitely there. But Jalen Carter's potential is there too. I mean, if it wasn't for, the off-the-field stuff that, we've seen go on, Jalen Carter would have been a top 5 pick this year, and it's not just because of his run prowess on the inside. It's his pass rushing ability. It's his elite athleticism, bend, power, length, power to speed combo, pass rush moves. I think Jalen Carter, it's more likely, if someone's going to lead this team in sacks, Gino has talked about how kind of Nolan Smith might be like the cleanup guy where he feeds off of Reddick, Sweat, and Graham a lot, and so his sack total might be higher than you think, even with the snaps reduced, which I could see that. But I think Jalen Carter, based on the opportunity he might have, the overall talent, he also has pass rushing ability just as good, if not better, than Nolan Smith. And he's going to be feeding off some great players, too, on the inside. It's not like, there's bums on the inside. I mean, Fletcher Cox was great last year. I think Jordan Davis is going to be a much improved pass rusher this year. And even if not, look at what he did, the space he cleared up for Carter on the inside at Georgia. So I would say it's close. You can make the point for both. I would go Jalen Carter over Nolan Smith. Let's go to the secondary now. What's more likely? Darius Slay or James Bradberry follow up their elite 2022 seasons in 2023. It's tough. I think both are still going to be good this year. And Gino and I have a few times on the show over the last few weeks mentioned if a position group, if a player, a star from last year is going to regress, who would it be? And we both said maybe James Bradberry, maybe Darius Slay. They're pushing 30. Last year at the end, it was a little shaky for Slay. We know Bradberry in past years, coming off a career year, wasn't able to totally follow it up. And of course, is Bradberry going to be just as good as last year? It's going to be tough to do that the more you age. I think both are going to be pretty close, but who would match the play of last year? I would still put my money on Slay, actually. Even though Bradberry was better down the stretch than Darius, I think it would still be Slay. And one reason, outside of Slay's done it now 2 years in a row. I mean, he was incredible in 2021. He was amazing in 2022. So it's hard to, this guy, executives just the other day voted, it was an anonymous ESPN poll, voting the top 5 corners, and executives had Darius Slay as a top 5 cornerback in the NFL this year. So I think it's Slay over Bradberry. Another reason for it, I think it's speed. It's a speed factor. And of course, the Eagles, the zone coverage they run, I think it's great for Bradberry, and he's so smart, and he always makes good plays on the ball. But I think Darius Slay's speed, especially in the modern day NFL, is very important, and I haven't seen any signs of him slowing down in that way. So the speed factor for me and the consistency over his career versus Bradberry is why I would probably say Slay over Bradberry in 2023 to match last year's play. Not who's not going to regress, it's who's going to be just as elite as they were last year. And Bradberry, remember, he was an all-pro last year. Like that's a tough year to match, especially when you're in your 30s. So I'll say Slay over Bradberry, but that's definitely a good question. All right, one more here. What's more likely on defense? Howie Roseman makes a move for a linebacker or safety before the season starts or by the NFL trade deadline in 2023. I would say linebacker. And is there a guarantee that one of these three safeties or all three or two of the three are going to be really reliable and they're going to replace Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and Marcus Epps and make you totally forget about that strong safety duo last year? Probably. I mean, I don't think there's a likelihood that all three of them are terrible and can't do it. But I really believe in Sidney Brown, the Eagles' third-round pick this year. I think he is a playmaker. He's an athlete. He seems really smart, really intelligent football IQ, good ball tracking skills. For an undersized kid, he is physical. I really think they got something in Sidney Brown. He was a top 5 safety of mine heading into this year's class. And then I think Edmonds and Blankenship, I don't have super high expectations for them, but I also don't think this is, Jaquaski Tart or who else? Anthony Harris 2.0. So I'm not overly confident in safety, although I really like Sidney Brown, but I'm more confident than linebacker as a whole. I think Nakobe Dean, of all these players I mentioned, even over Sidney Brown, I'm most confident in. I think they have the best player at linebacker over safety, but the total group of safeties plus the corners they have, you can maybe cross-train. I think you could convince me that they would stand pat at safety more than linebacker. If Nicholas Morrow, remember, this guy barely has any guaranteed money. I'm not saying he's going to be Eric Wilson. As I mentioned yesterday, though, the Eagles don't have a great track record of signing free agent linebackers outside of Kazir White last year. I mean, they haven't always botched it. They had Nigel Bradham, too, in 2016, and he helped you win a Super Bowl. But normally it hasn't panned out for Howie. So if they were going to add somebody, I think they prioritize safety more, so in that way you could argue maybe safety, but I think if it's based on a need, it's at linebacker because Morrow just is not cutting it, and you can't always run just one linebacker out there, especially if you don't love all three of your safeties. So that's another part of it too, and if Christian Ellis doesn't step up, or I mentioned Davian Taylor yesterday or Sean Bradley, I think maybe they try to call up Arizona and say, hey, is Isaiah Simmons available? Hey, Baltimore, is Patrick Queen available? Somebody like that. I think that's more likely, but those are definitely the two positions. If they're going to add somebody, it's at safety or corner. All right, let's wrap things up on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, getting into the quarterback position a little bit more. I was watching that quarterback show on Netflix with Patrick Mahomes, Kirk Cousins, and Marcus Mariota, a very random trio to pick, but it's really good. The Mahomes stuff is, as much as it hurts me because the Eagles lost to him in the Super Bowl, it is a little, I don't want to say it's easier to swallow, but when you lose to an all-time great, I imagine if you're an NBA fan, you lose to LeBron James, or if in the 90s, you're a Jazz fan, or I don't know, somebody, and you lose to Michael Jordan, or, if you lose to Tom Brady. The Eagles didn't, luckily. I mean, they did in 2004, though, but, I think it's easier to stomach. It's a lot better if you beat the GOAT, and I think it feels better. That's why 2017 was such a storybook. I mean, to beat a 500-yard passing GOAT is incredible with a backup. But I think it's a little easier. And, of course, the Chiefs have Andy Reid, and the Kelsey brothers. It's hard to totally hate that football team. So I've enjoyed the Mahomes stuff. The Kirk Cousins I could do without. I could not care less about Kirk Cousins. But Marcus Mariota, the Eagles have a quarterback in this documentary, and it's really cool to kind of see behind the scenes. He's not like a super over-the-top, enthusiastic guy. He's not somebody like Jameis Winston that's fun to watch on like a Hard Knocks kind of special, where he's like a kind of a clown character. But Mariota, very collected, very mature. And, you just watch him, and that's the one thing you can tell, he had it all the way back to his days at Oregon. And that's why when, he had the talent and the arm strength and you could see the mobility, he's winning Heisman's, it makes sense why he was a top pick. It makes sense why I'll never fault Chip Kelly for wanting to sell the farm, even though he says he didn't. trying to do everything it could to move up from 20 to 2 to get Mariota, because you'll get the maturity too. It's part of why we love Jalen Hurts, is that calm demeanor. It's definitely franchise quarterback level stuff. And for the Eagles, I was thinking about that, to have that kind of quarterback room where your starter is like that, but now your backup has that same mentality. That is so good for the team when, especially in a chaotic city like Philly, an unpredictable league like the NFL, there's so many expectations, so much can go wrong in a year. I don't think the Eagles, they need this because they have so many mature veterans and young players across the roster. But when you have this chaotic thing that is the NFL regular season and playoffs going on, when you have at the most important position some of the calmest people, when they have the most pressure on their shoulders over anybody, and you've got two of those guys, and it's especially guys that have been through the ringer. We all know Jalen Hurts and what he's been through. But Marcus Mariota, too. I mean, this was a Heisman-winning second overall pick that won a playoff game in his second year, right? Or third year? He was drafted so it was his third year. He wins a playoff game. Then he gets benched for a backup, kind of like Carson Wentz watches his backup take his team to a conference championship game, loses his job, gets an elbow injury, goes to Vegas as a long-term backup, gets a chance to be a starter in Atlanta again last year, loses that job as well to a rookie. And so this guy's been through it all as well, the highs and lows. Jalen and Marcus have both been through it. And so that just continues to add to this team's ability to overcome adversity, overcome pressure, and meet expectations. And a lot of teams across, it's easier said than done to not listen to the outside noise and not let that kind of stuff impact the team. It's impacted Eagles teams in the past. We know that, talking about it on this show. So, just watching that documentary just kind of enhances, it just kind of shows again another guy the Eagles have in this room that is a mature leader. It's, the culture of this team is incredible. I think Mariota is going to be a perfect addition to it. And, having quarterback camaraderie is great. And, of course, in 2020, Wentz and Hurts didn't hate each other, but they definitely weren't boys, and there was a lot of, Hurts wanted to be a starting quarterback. Carson Wentz didn't. He was mad at the team. He wasn't mad at Hurts, but he was mad at the team for drafting a quarterback. That wasn't a great relationship for the football team as a whole. I'm not blaming Jalen or Carson. I don't think it was either of their faults. But overall, that wasn't a great situation. I think early on, Nick Foles and Carson Wentz had a really good relationship. I think, Chase Daniel, have that kind of leader, behind a young quarterback. I think that's super important. And so, to have that kind of support, especially when and this is, again, why I was a little mad in 2020 about taking a quarterback in the second round. When you have that kind of guy as a backup, and he knows he's a backup, the team knows the role, the starter knows the role, and they're all confident and they're all secure in that standing, it's a perfect setup. And so, not just me being the 2015 kid that loved paying attention to the Mariota, the Eagles rumors. That's not just why I like that he's in Philly. It's the stuff that we see in the documentary. Again, the talent isn't there anymore when it comes to arm talent anymore, but I'm really happy Mariota's a Philadelphia Eagle, and it's been cool to follow along in this documentary. All right, Eagles fans, that's going to do it for this Thursday edition of your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, Locked on Eagles. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow for another edition of the show. Gino will be back on, and then we're Monday through Friday next week as we preview training camp. All the positions of this football team on both sides of the ball, we're going to dive deeper into right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. I'm Louis DiBiase signing off. As always, thank you for downloading, thank you for watching and listening, and let's go Birds.